Hello, everyone. Welcome to this International Macrohistory online seminar. My name is Olivier Accominotti, and I am a professor of economic history at the London School of Economics. And today we are very pleased to host Thomas Drechsel, who will present his research on the effects of political pressure on the Fed, a narrative approach with new data. So let me introduce Thomas briefly. He holds a PhD in economics from the LSE, and he is currently an assistant professor in the economics department at the University of Maryland. Thomas' research is really at the intersection of macroeconomics and economic history, and he has published extensively in this area. So we are especially glad to have him here today, present his recent work on the impact of political interventions on monetary policy in the US during the 20th century. So before I hand out to Thomas, let me briefly outline the rules of engagement. So Thomas will present his paper for 40 minutes without interruption, except for clarification questions. And this will be followed by a 20-minute Q&A session. If you would like to ask a question, please enter it in the Q&A box in Zoom, not in the chat section in the Q&A. And I will summarize and transmit your question to Thomas after his presentation. If your question is a clarification question, please flag it as such in the Q&A so that I am aware and I can possibly interrupt Thomas. And finally, after the formal Q&A session, you are welcome to stay for an additional 15 minutes for a more informal discussion on Thomas' paper. Right? So I hope this covers everything. So without further ado, let me now hand over the floor to Thomas for his presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Olivier, for the kind introduction. And thank you to the organizers for inviting me to present the paper. Let me share my screen. All right. So this paper is about understanding the economic effects of political pressure on the Federal Reserve. And it's motivated by a growing concern that the Fed gets politicized. In his first presidency, Donald Trump very openly lashed out against the Fed for keeping policy too tight. And some recent research has found that this had an actual impact, at least on market expectations. We also know that deficits and debt levels are high at the moment. So this gives a temptation for politicians to tell central banks to lower rates. We also know Donald Trump has been elected again and has already made comments about the Federal Reserve. So this is certainly a timely topic. Now, when it comes to studying the effects of political pressure on central banks empirically, there are key challenges. Political pressure is a kind of fluffy concept. We need to think about good definitions. We need to think about good measurement. And those are things I'm going to try to do in this paper. But before I tell you what I do, let me give you two starting points in the literature that motivate my work. Basically, when it comes to empirically studying the role of political pressure on central banks, there are two existing approaches. The first approach is a literature that looks at the effects of threats to central bank independence and the benefits of central bank independence across countries. A key reference here is Alesina and Summers 1993. So the idea in that literature is we look at different countries, we assign a score of central bank independence to different countries, for example, based on expert surveys, and then we correlate that with macroeconomic outcomes. And a typical finding in this literature is that countries with more independent central banks enjoy lower inflation. that's one approach that's certainly very useful and insightful. The other empirical approach uses macroeconomic data from within a country across time, typically the US. And this literature uses fully specified regime switching DSGE models. The idea in these models is that there are monetary fiscal interactions. So there is a notion of political pressure in the sense that in a certain regime that can occur in these models, in the background, the fiscal authority entices the central bank to accommodate deficits by easier monetary policy. So this literature has a theoretical branch where these models are built and characterized, and then the empirical branch estimates those models on macro data. So these are the two approaches, either cross-country or fully specified models that are estimated on the data. What I do in this paper is new to the best of my knowledge. My idea here is that I want to identify variation in political pressure, shocks to political pressure on the Fed over time. And I'm going to do this using new data that I collected and using a macro identification approach. And ideally, what I want to do is essentially, I want to say the same way in which we say identify monetary policy shocks or fiscal policy shocks and then construct impulse response functions. I want to do that for what I call a political pressure shock. And I want to quantify those effects. Ideally, what I want to do is to say, if there is 1% more pressure, how much more inflation do we subsequently get? That's the idea of my paper. Now, how do I do that? There are two layers, two components to my approach, new data and an identification strategy. So let me talk about both of those in turn before I get into more of the details. So the data part consists of newly collected historical archival data. And my idea is basically to say the following. I want to have some indicator from the data that is informative about the degree of political pressure over time. Now, political pressure on the central bank can take so many forms. It can be in public, it can be in private, it can happen through different people. So my idea was to collect data on personal interactions, personal meetings between US presidents and Fed officials. I'll talk much more about that data, but my idea is that one way political pressure can be exerted is that the most important politician, the president, basically goes to the Fed and tries to tell the Fed what to do. Therefore, I had this idea of collecting these personal meetings. So I did that. Again, I'll talk much more about that. But what this gives me is over a long time period, 1933 to 2016, I get a time series that shows me the amount of meetings. Now that data, it is interesting. I'll show you some pictures. But that data by itself is not necessarily political pressure. That data just reflects meetings between politicians and the central bank. Those meetings could happen for different reasons. In particular, those meetings could happen with a higher frequency if inflation is higher, because inflation is higher. So there's actually a reverse causality from macroeconomic conditions to these meetings. So they're interesting. They're not necessarily pressure without additional assumptions, without additional information. Therefore, in the second part of the paper, the second component of my approach is an identification scheme. And what I do here is the following. Basically, I say, well, these meetings correlate with macroeconomic data, standard macroeconomic data, GDP, inflation, and so forth. And the causality basically can run both directions. Meetings can affect the macroeconomy. That's what I'm interested in. That's the pressure part. But the macroeconomy can also affect meetings. So what I do is that I use then an approach where I say, in certain periods, I know these meetings occurred mainly with the goal of pressuring the Fed and not because of conditions in the macroeconomy. And there were two presidents in history for which we know they exerted very explicit pressure on the Fed, and those were Richard Nixon and Lyndon B. Johnson. So what I basically say is the meetings and the macro data, everything depends on everything. But in certain periods, I impose the causality runs one way. And that's what I do in a structural VAR. That's sort of the idea behind the identification. I'll get to the technical details of the VAR later on. This allows me to then construct impulse response functions to this one directional causality, to this thing that I call a political pressure shock. Again, I'll tell you about the details. Let me briefly preview the findings. What I find is that when a president pressures the Fed to ease policy, and that, by the way, is important when I talk about political pressure shocks, these are always going to be pressure to ease policy. Pressure to tighten policy in principle could also happen, but that's not what I identify here. So when that happens, when the president pressures the Fed to ease monetary policy, inflation and inflation expectations increase, and they increase relatively gradually but strongly. At the same time, I don't find much of an effect on other macroeconomic variables. In particular, GDP or real activity indicators don't increase in response to this political pressure shock. That's interesting for several reasons. One reason is, why does the president pressure the Fed? Usually that's somehow to stimulate the economy. That doesn't seem to be successful from the point of view of the president. And it's also interesting because that makes this shock here very different from a typical monetary policy shock. In a typical monetary policy expansion, we get lower rates bringing about higher prices and more activity. And that's the typical trade-off. It seems to be that a political pressure-induced monetary easing gives the inflationary effect, and it doesn't give much of the activity effect. I have some formal exposition of why in my methodology a standard monetary policy shock and the political pressure shock are different and what explains that. And to give you the quick intuition, it's about expectations. Essentially, if they met completely in secret and no one knows that the Fed cuts rates because there's this meeting, then it would be like a standard monetary policy shock. It would just be a surprise change in monetary policy. But I'm going to show you those meetings are actually to some degree observed by the public. The media report on those meetings. Therefore, the public understands, this monetary easing happens alongside meetings between the president and the Fed, and they adjust their behavior different than from a standard monetary policy surprise, because the Fed's credibility essentially has taken a hit. So these are the broad findings, and I also promise that I can quantify the effects. So it's of course, the way I can tell this is I can say, one more meeting gives X% more inflation, but meetings are a strange unit, so I can renormalize that in terms of the behavior of a given president. And the quantification, the headline quantification I provide is, if there are pressure-induced meetings with the amount that is half as much of what happened during Nixon over a 6-month period, then the US price level rises in the subsequent 10 years by 8%. Okay, that is an economically meaningful effect. It's actually not a super dramatic effect. Following the Nixon era, the price level in the following 10 years went up by like 120% because there were oil shocks, there was all sorts of other things. But the pressure part that my VAR elicits gives this 8% price level increase. Now, in terms of external validity, we can discuss what does 50% Nixon mean? Is another president say, is Trump's pressure the way it happens at the moment? What percentage of Nixon is that? We can debate that, of course. But it is a quantification I provide. All right, so I've given you kind of a big overview of everything, and now I'm gonna go into the details. The first part is just the data. No identification here, no causality. It's just the data that I collected, which I hope many of you will find interesting. So essentially, US presidents, after their presidency, get a presidential library. The library is a bit like a museum, but it also stores many documents from each presidency. Part of those documents are the president's daily calendars. I'll show you an example in a minute, but essentially these are for every day in the presidency, a detailed itemized log of what each president did at what time. So what I did, also with the help of research assistants, is to go over all of those schedules. They start becoming available with Roosevelt and they end with Obama, because Biden and Trump don't have presidential libraries yet. I go over all of those schedules and find every meeting that is with a Federal Reserve official. For some presidents, that's relatively easy because some of the libraries make these schedules nicely available in a digital format. For some other presidents, it's very messy, and we actually had to go to the presidential library, basically to the basement, open some boxes, and kind of go over these schedules manually. Here's an example. This is a day in the presidency of Jimmy Carter, July 19th, 1980. And for that day, the schedule had 4 pages. So you see at the bottom here, it says page 1 out of 4, page 2 out of 4. So there are 2 more pages, which I'm omitting here. This gives you an idea of the level of detail that these schedules have. This day is a Saturday, and you see how basically some of these slots are as short as 1 minute or 10 minutes or 5 minutes, and it gives you this very detailed account of what Jimmy Carter did on that day. And that's a quite representative length and representative level of detail, which exists for every day, for every president since FDR. Now let me zoom in on the second page. There is one meeting here at 10:15, which is between Jimmy Carter and the chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve, Paul Volcker. So this is the meeting then that I record in my database of President-Fed interactions. I record this meeting is with Paul Volcker. It's 20 minutes long. It occurred on that day. There's no evidence of anybody else attending the meeting, and that goes into my database. And I like this example here because it's kind of funny that afterwards the president talked with the first lady for exactly 1 minute, and that's recorded in the schedule. And by the way, this P here means it's a phone call. So phone calls are also included in my data. Now, in the paper, I report a lot of detail about these meetings. Let me give you some basic summary statistics. In the 1933 to 2016 period, I found more than 800 meetings. That was certainly much more than I had expected, because with an independent central bank, the head of the state should really not talk so often to the central bank. The average length is 53 minutes. Most of the meetings, 92%, were with the Fed chair, but 8% were with other officials, the vice chair, other members of the Board of Governors, also presidents of regional reserve banks appear in the data. I can see, for some meetings, I can see who else attended. I can characterize, was the meeting in a social setting? Was it on weekends? And I have all sorts of entertaining summary statistics in the paper. I do not see, and that's important, I do not see what was said in the meeting, at least not in these schedules. But I will talk later on that for some presidents, we know more of what happened in the meetings. I basically count those meetings. Let me show you the main picture that comes out of this data. So this is maybe the key picture of this whole presentation, which is the number of interactions, meetings, and phone calls that occurred between US presidents and Fed officials. And in principle, I have this meeting at a daily frequency with, many zeros, because on many days there are no meetings. So just to plot it here, I aggregated to annual frequency, which means on the y-axis, what you have is interactions per year. Now, what do we see here? We see there is really drastic variation in this variable. There are some presidents that almost never meet with Fed officials, and some presidents that meet very regularly with Fed officials. Two examples. Bill Clinton, in 8 years of his presidency, had only 6 interactions with Fed officials. These were typically some swearing-in ceremonies, say, of a new governor. Richard Nixon was the president who met most with Fed officials. Under Nixon, we don't see the biggest spike. The biggest spike was under Ford. But under Nixon, basically the integral, the sum of the meetings is the largest. And in the second half of 1971, a period that I'm going to talk more about, Nixon speaks with Fed Chair Arthur Burns on average every 5 days. So very, very frequent interactions. You also, if you know from memory the plot for US inflation, and you plot that on top of this, you actually see there is already a kind of raw correlation between these meetings and inflation. Now, I'm not claiming causality here. The causality could go exactly the other way. These meetings here could not reflect pressure. They could happen for other reasons. They could be because, they want to talk about baseball, or they could meet because something happens in the economy. You see here also in the Great Recession, meetings goes up. So this is not pressure here. This is just interactions. It's certainly an interesting view on history, but it's not yet pressure. Okay, but that is the data. And by the way, I make this data available on my website for others to use if you have some idea on what else could be done with this data. Now,
So,
I used it.
Thomas, I'll
Yes.
just interrupt you because we have a question which looks very much like a clarification question
Yep.
in the Q&A. So Ankun Saka is asking whether there were any confidential meetings which didn't appear in the presidential diaries. And I would add here whether the question about the whether there's any time variation in the confidentiality of these meetings, which may affect your data.
Yeah, very good question. The true answer is I don't really know that. What I can say is these schedules come out with some delay. Okay, they are sort of historical documents that are released with some delay. So they're not when they come out, they are not worried about the information somehow being explosive or something. I cannot know that maybe some secret meetings happened that were never recorded in the schedules. I cannot know that. This is the best that I can do. Some schedules are a little bit redacted also. I see that sometimes there are some meetings that are kind of blackened out. They are redacted, which I assume is something related to national security. I doubt the Fed meetings would be affected by that, but I also cannot know that. It's kind of the best I can do. I might be missing some. And what becomes important later on, in real time, journalists do get an idea that these meetings happen, okay? In the way that they are reported in the schedules, I don't think the building of the schedule that there's this concern, but when the meetings happen, journalists do report about that. I hope that was okay. Short answer is I cannot know about secret meetings.
Thank you. Thanks. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so let me now talk about identification. Here's the idea. What I want to say is those meetings might indicate pressure, but they might be responses to economic conditions. So what I want to do is I want to find some periods, some parts of this time series where I can argue those meetings satisfy two criteria. They took place for political reasons and they impacted monetary policy. So I now kind of read history, read historical accounts, read books to see, can I point at least to parts of this time series where I can claim these are episodes where the meetings were done with the purpose of exerting pressure. And there are two episodes here. One was Richard Nixon pressured Arthur Burns to ease policy in 1971. And Lyndon B. Johnson pressured William McChesney Martin to ease monetary policy in 1967. I use both of those episodes formally in my VAR, but in this presentation today, I'm going to talk only about the Nixon episode, just to make things a little bit simpler. Basically, when I add the Johnson episode to my analysis, everything becomes a little sharper, a little more, the inference becomes more significant, but exploiting the Nixon variation is already sufficient to get my results. So I'm only going to talk about Nixon. So Nixon, after he became president, appointed Arthur Burns as Fed chair. Nixon and Burns had known each other for a long time. Burns was already the CEA chair under Eisenhower. He was kind of well connected within the Republican Party. They knew each other. Nixon appoints him, and there's this funny quote from the swearing-in ceremony where he says, "I respect his independence, but I hope he will independently conclude that he should follow my views." Nixon becomes president, appoints Burns. In the beginning, Burns is quite optimistic about the Nixon presidency. We know this from a personal diary that he wrote that was only released a few years ago. But basically, around the time when Nixon started thinking about re-election, the second Nixon election was in 1972. In 1971, he starts thinking about re-election. The Watergate scandal, all of those things start happening in the background, but he also starts becoming obsessed with the Fed. And basically, we know from Burns's diary, I'm putting up some quotes here, that he very explicitly told Arthur Burns to ease monetary policy. He wanted monetary policy to be looser, to stimulate activity, to make voters happy, to be reelected. And he was very explicit about that. Burns's diary is one source. A second source, I don't have that here on the slides, but I have it in the paper, are the Nixon tapes. Nixon also taped the conversations, and we have transcripts of some of the meetings that happened. And he basically told Burns, look, you better ease monetary conditions, otherwise a disaster will happen. Now, did Burns react to this pressure? That is a little bit more contested, and I'm sure some of you who know about this period have views on that. My understanding is he did react to the pressure. And here is my best piece of evidence that I find the most useful to argue that. What I'm showing here is first the period before the Nixon re-election under Burns's tenure as Fed chair, and the period after. I'm splitting the period. And then I'm showing as the dark blue bar, the change in the federal funds rate. As the light blue bar, I show the Romer and Romer monetary policy shock. That shock conveys what part of the variation in the federal funds rate cannot be explained with economic conditions. We see that before the Nixon re-election, there was a strong monetary easing, and all of that easing, according to Romer and Romer, can be attributed to a monetary policy shock, all of it. So that easing cannot be explained with economic conditions. After the Nixon re-election, there was a massive monetary tightening. You see, that's an 800 basis point tightening over 1.5 years. Very, very sharp tightening. And that is largely, according to the Romers, a systematic tightening. Because of this shock that happened here, inflation came up, and the Fed then endogenously really heavily leaned against inflation. Okay, so there was certainly an easing in monetary policy that coincided here that you cannot explain with economic conditions. One thing I also do in the paper, I don't have time for that today, but in the paper, I also document voting patterns in the FOMC and how voting patterns changed around exactly that time period, which is also suggestive evidence that basically Burns tried to push cuts through the committee, and there was lots of opposition through these cuts prior to the Nixon re-election. Okay, so basically I argue there's this time series. In general, it moves for many reasons, but during the Nixon years, during the second half of 1971, to be more precise, I say, no, in that period, those meetings did not move because of economic conditions. Those meetings moved because Nixon wanted to be reelected, and that had an effect on policy. That is my identifying assumption. So if you don't kind of buy into that assumption, then what I'm going to show you now, you're not going to buy into that, but that's the assumption I require to get the results I get. Now, how I've given you that identifying assumption in kind of an intuitive way. How do I implement that technically? That I do in a structural VAR. And here I use a technique called narrative sign restrictions. That's based on a paper in the AR. And the idea is the following. I set up a VAR. This table shows the variables that are in my VAR, the interactions between presidents and the Fed, and standard macro data, the price level, interest rates, real GDP, and some fiscal variables. Now, the first thing I do is I'm going to put sign restrictions on this VAR to basically define the type of shock that I call a political pressure shock. What co-movement characterizes this shock? And then I say a political pressure shock is something that makes meetings go higher, interest rates go lower, and leads to higher prices. That's the co-movement I define as political pressure. Now, meetings higher, interest rates lower, that's clear. I have been telling you what I mean by political pressure is meetings entice the Fed to lower interest rates. I also put the sign restriction on prices, on the price level, because I need one more restriction to isolate a shock here. And this is to me the least restrictive restriction in the sense that when there is a monetary easing, the minimum thing that happens in any model, even in a model where money is neutral vis-a-vis activity, is that prices would go up. Monetary easing must mean prices go up. So I could put a restriction on activity, on fiscal variables. Those would be more restrictive in my view, but it's certainly something we discuss. And I'm currently working on a new version of the paper where I actually have some alternatives to this, which I don't want to go into now, but we can perhaps discuss this. So these sign restrictions, that's what defines what I mean by political pressure. These sign restrictions on their own don't give me impulse response functions that let me conclude anything. Therefore, I put an additional restriction, and that's a narrative restriction. I say the shock described by these signs in 1971 Q3 and 1971 Q4 is the major contributor to meetings, to this interaction count. So that is a restriction on the historical variance decomposition of the VAR. This is a technique that was invented by Antolin Diaz Rubio Ramirez. They use this for oil shocks. They say an oil supply shock is defined by certain signs, prices up, production down. And it was the main explanation of oil prices during the Iranian Revolution, say. I use this technique here. I say a political pressure shock leads to this co-movement, and it was the main contributor to meetings during the Nixon height of the pressure. In general, it can not be a main contributor to meetings, but during this period it was. Let me skip this slide and let me show you the main results. These are the impulse response functions to a political pressure shock. I have two sets of impulse response functions here. The gray ones are the impulse response functions only based on the sign restrictions. So you see here, I impose, there's a positive sign here, a positive sign here, and a negative sign here. But then subsequently, the gray bands become so wide that you cannot conclude anything. The red bands, those are the impulse response functions when I impose the Nixon episode. I impose that this shock was the main driver of meetings during Nixon, which really sharpens the inference here. So the 6 panels here, I should say, are the 6 variables in my VAR. So what I find is that 10 more meetings, this is a normalization. I can make any normalizations here. I can show you this for 20 meetings, 1 meetings. I show it for 10 meetings. That leads to a monetary easing of about 1 percentage points, 100 basis points. And that leads to a gradual and very persistent increase in the price level with a 5% higher price level after 10 years. These here are 40 quarters. I do not find much action in real activity or fiscal variables. Okay, I do not find a response here. This contrasts very much with a monetary policy shock. So I also identify a monetary policy shock in this system. This shock basically exogenously leads to lower interest rates. And there I find the price level goes up and activity goes up. I know I'm soon out of time, Olivier, but let me talk a little bit about 2 things. How much time do I have exactly?
Well, if you could wrap it up in the following 5 minutes, that would be great.
Perfect. Yeah, that's great. That's great. So one thing I want to show you, what the VAR gives me is also, so this here, that's the economic effects of my political pressure shock. That shows if a political pressure shock materializes, this happens to macroeconomic variables. And you get a price effect, you don't get an activity effect. What the VAR is also telling me, is this shock generally an important shock? Does it explain much of the data? And here the answer is actually no, not so much. What I'm plotting here is the black line is the US rate of inflation, and the blue line is the contribution of political pressure shocks. Remember, I impose that the contribution of these shocks is high on meetings in 1971. But here I compute the estimated contribution in the VAR on inflation. What do you see? A lot of inflation is not explained by political pressure. That's what we would have expected. Inflation is explained by demand shocks, supply shocks, and so on. A little bit of it is explained by political pressure. And this sort of mainly occurs in the 60s and 70s. So I impose it for Nixon. The model also, quote unquote, detects some political pressure under Johnson, also a bit of political pressure under Ford and Carter, which we can discuss. Now, the one other thing I want to say, and I will wrap up soon, is why is it that there is the lack of this response in activity? Why is that? I also identify a monetary policy shock in this system. The monetary policy shock leads to a stronger effect in activity, but I also have some additional results here on expectations. So the top row here is the mean of inflation expectations in the Livingston survey. The bottom row is the dispersion of inflation expectations in the Livingston survey. So it's a measure of inflation disagreement. The first column shows you the response to a political pressure shock. The second column shows you the response to a monetary policy shock normalized to lead to the same Fed funds rate reaction, normalized to the same interest rate reaction. We see that the monetary policy shock gives a bit of an increase in inflation expectations, whereas the political pressure shock gives a delayed and very large increase in inflation expectations and in inflation disagreement. So it seems to be the case that rates fall when there's a standard rate reduction, a standard monetary policy shock. This doesn't affect inflation expectations very much. It leads to an inflation effect, but inflation's expectations remain anchored. When there's this political pressure shock, inflation expectations really take off. So the fact that this was because of pressure makes agents adjust their view of the future. Now, how can this be? How can they actually adjust their expectations? How do they know it's political pressure? Well, I document in the paper, and here I'm just showing you one screenshot. The media understands the pressure. I show that basically when more meetings happen, the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, they start reporting on it. They get worried about it. Okay, I don't formally exploit that newspaper data in my VAR, but it's basically corroborating evidence for the fact that this shock transmits differently from a standard monetary shock. It's kind of a monetary shock, right? But it's different because it happens through meetings. Meetings are observable to some degree, and expectations can adjust. Sorry for rushing a little bit. I'm gonna wrap up here. Basically, the idea here is that I collected new data and I came up with this identification approach that uses historical information to identify this object, what I call political pressure shock. We know political pressure on central banks has bad consequences for inflation. We knew that from previous research, but this is a different approach. And I can quantify it. It uses US variation over time, so it's a little bit different. Yeah, I hope you find the results useful. I make the data, as I said previously, also these estimated shocks, basically the exogenous part of the meeting. I make that available on my website for others to use. So let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomas, for a very clear and interesting presentation. So this is now time for the Q&A session. We have 5 questions in the Q&A queue. So I'll start with those. So first of all, we have 2 questions about the data, which I will group together. Orkun Saka is asking whether the number of meetings that a president has with the Fed should not be standardized by the total number of meetings that every president has. And Patrick Onohan is asking whether it could be that the completeness of the presidential diaries varies over time.
Yeah, great questions. On the first question, I would actually like to do that. It's very costly to collect data from these schedules. I went through all of those and I collected the Fed meetings. Ideally, what would be nice is to normalize it either by all meetings or somehow by, for example, economic related meetings, and then divide by that. That would require me to basically find also all of those meetings and all of the schedules. This is something I'm actually doing right now. So this might be for a different project, but this would also enable me to do a normalization. But I'm currently working on digitizing the entirety of those schedules, all meetings, not Fed, everything else. And I have some ideas on questions that can be studied there. but this is a huge undertaking. I think this will take me many, many months because I have to go back to the libraries and you saw the schedules, right? That those 4 pages, I have that for every day and then digitize that and come up with some kind of system to label the meetings into different types. It's a big endeavor. I agree with you. I don't have it here, but I'm working on it, and I'm working on much more with the schedules. And then the second question, yes, it's possible that the nature, style, level of detail of the diary changes through time. But I mean, I looked at them and they are remarkably similar over time. There are some changes. Actually, the Obama schedules, actually, the level of detail there drops a lot. I don't know, the Obama Presidential Library, I think they are more like summary schedules and not the raw schedules. Other than Obama, and you can look at this yourself for some presidents, you can Google the Presidential Library, look at the schedules. They look remarkably similar in style and level of detail. Again, when I have digitized them in their entirety, I can do more to check that. But at this stage, it's a concern. I agree. It's not a huge concern just from kind of seeing how these schedules look over time. But they are both very valid questions. Thank you.
Thank you. So the next questions relate to your identification. You have 3 sign restrictions in your SVAR model, and Maitem Abdulrahim is asking whether you need 3 or whether you could just do with 2.
Yeah, great question. I wish I could do with 2, but two is not enough in practice. I can't conclude anything on impulse response functions with just 2 sign restrictions. I need the third restriction. I wish I could drop it because it would be kind of cleaner, because of course I put a restriction on prices, and price is really the variable that I talk about that goes up. So that is a little bit unsatisfactory. I should say this restriction is only on impact. So if you look at the impulse response function, this kind of blip here, this is what the sign restriction does. But the really interesting thing is what happens over here, that's unrestricted. Okay. So I hope you still find the restriction. I hope you don't find it too much of the restriction assumes the result kind of thing, because it's only an impact restriction. What I can also tell you, and maybe I can put up actually a backup slide here. If you are somehow opposed to sign restrictions, if you think I just find that an unsatisfactory scheme, I also did a very simple Cholesky. That has many problems. Okay. We can now talk about, okay, is Cholesky the right thing? But what I did here is I just took the VAR and I ordered the meeting variable last. What this means in a Cholesky ordering, what this means is the meetings can respond to any other variable contemporaneously. Meetings can react to everything, but the other variables react to meetings with a 1/4 lag. That's what Cholesky does. We can debate whether that's a good assumption. It's just something different now. But what I find with that identification scheme is actually meetings going up leads to an easing in policy, leads to a strong increase in inflation, and not much action in the other variables. So there are no sign restrictions at all here. There's not even a Nixon restriction here. This is very basic Cholesky. This gives you an idea of just the co-movement in the data, what it speaks to. And what is interesting here is, again, not much inactivity, big response in the price level. And what I find interesting here is here, you get a bit of an overshooting in the T-bill rate. So what seems to happen if I don't use here the Nixon episode is more meetings lead to a kind of a temporary cut, and then inflation goes up, and then there's an endogenous tightening happen later on. But in the Nixon era, when I go back to my main results, the cut is more persistent and it is not offset later with a hike. So if I don't do the Cholesky, but I put more restrictions with the science, with Nixon and so on, it looks sort of similar, but the policy thing here, the Nixon years seem to tell us that the policy reaction was a bit different, and that's reflected in the impulse response functions. Sorry, a bit of a lengthy response, but I slipped in another result, and I hope you find it useful.
Thank you. Orkun Saka had a further question about your identification. So especially your narrative saying restriction seems to be related to electoral incentives of Nixon, which makes Orkun worried that your result may be driven by a spike in political uncertainty, which may lead the Fed to ease monetary policy. So I don't know if you've thought about that.
Yeah, I think that's certainly possible. That would be a problem for me because that would mean the meetings during that period are just reflective of, I don't know, crazy political developments. Crazy political developments lead to macro uncertainty, and that in turn leads the Fed to cut. It's possible. It's possible, and it would be a concern because it would lead, the true reason would be like a macro shock and not this political pressure shock. I agree that I cannot fully account for that, although my reading of that period isn't that this was such a big deal. After all, the prospect of getting reelected didn't look so bad for Nixon. It's actually it's a bit of a puzzle why he also did Watergate and those things. He won after all in a landslide. Actually, somewhere here, maybe you find this interesting given your question. Where do I somewhere have a button? Okay, maybe I'll just jump ahead. I hope I won't make you dizzy
Look,
with
we have a few more questions, so maybe
Yeah.
maybe I'll move to the next one, and
Yeah.
maybe we can leave that for the informal discussion after one.
Okay.
So another one I have about the methodology is by Irfan Ahmad Shah, who's asking whether you could use local projections. Yeah, so
Yeah. So my identification is a VAR-based identification. So to estimate the shock, I do need the VAR because it's a sign restriction methodology. To construct the impulse response functions, it's possible to not construct them from the VAR, but to use local projections to construct them. That's possible. And these inflation expectation results that I showed you, those were actually local projection results because the expectations data starts later. It starts in the 60s. So I just took my shock and constructed impulse response functions with local projections. So it's possible for the IRFs. The identification scheme, though, does require the VAR.
okay, thanks. Okay, then the next questions relate to how you measure political pressure and what forms of political pressure you could observe, right? So I have Caroline Follin first as noting that there are alternatives to presidential meetings, of course, as Fed officials could meet with other members of the administration, and they would constitute public pressure as well. Elena Segeza also has a few questions about that. I'll take the last one, especially she notes that in recent decades, there have been fewer interactions between US presidents and Fed chairmen. But at the same time, it's possible that this has been accompanied with new forms of pressure. So, how could you account for these other types of political pressure?
Yeah, these are really great points. I completely agree with that. The way I see it is that pressure can happen through many channels. All of them are quite hard to measure. One channel here is through personal interactions, and I found a way to quantify that, to measure that. But that means I'm still leaving other channels on the table. There might be forms of pressure that I'm not picking up, and I just cannot account for them, and I'm missing them. That's how I see it. It's the disadvantages. It's one specific type, but the advantages I can measure it through time. I'm trying also to get a bit more at the public pressure because I talked about the observability of the meetings also. So this newspaper analysis in the current version of the paper is very anecdotal, but I'm trying to also construct indicators like time series from newspaper reporting about pressure. I find it so far quite messy, to be honest. It's quite hard to pinpoint. But there's certainly a lot that can be done. For the Trump years, people have looked at tweets. That's certainly interesting, but that has the advantage you can't go back so far. So I completely agree. There are other channels, they might become substitutes, but they also have challenges in measurement. And I'm trying to pin down one with this new data.
Mhm. So the next question is from Chris Mitchner. So Chris is a little concerned about including the periods prior to the Fed Treasury Accord of 1951, because prior to that agreement, basically the Fed was used as an instrument of Treasury policy, was not independent. There are few meetings between the Fed chair and the president in the 1933 to 1951 period, but could that simply be because they were actually meeting all the time? I mean, Treasury officials and Fed officials were actually meeting all the time and working together very closely.
Yeah, great point. So let me say a few things on that. I do a couple of sample splits in the paper. If I cut off data here, the results tend to get stronger. Okay, that makes sense because here there was very little interactions. Now, a natural point is also to cut off the data around here in the Treasury Fed Accord. Then the results actually get much weaker. My identification comes from Nixon, but it seems to be the case that in the VAR, the data from this period helps the identification, even if I don't impose the narrative restriction. And I think that's sensible because, as you point out, prior to the Treasury Fed Accord, you could argue that some political pressure was sort of baked in systematically into the variation in the data, and that helps me with identification. So that period actually matters in the VAR. And then another thing to say, I do find it also interesting that this blip here is kind of the Treasury Fed Accord. And after the Treasury Fed Accord, for something like 10 years, meetings are very small. I mean, they are not as flat as over here, but the Treasury Fed Accord seemed to have suppressed the meetings. But then with LBJ and Nixon, they kind of increased the meetings again very much. So I do think also in the raw data that the Treasury Fed Accord shows up there a little bit.
Thank you. Thanks. So I think we're now at the end of the allocated time for the formal Q&A session. So let me thank you, Thomas, very much for this very interesting paper and presentation. You are welcome to stay for an additional 15 minutes for a more informal discussion. But before we move to this part of the seminar, I would like to announce that the next International Macro History Online seminar will take place on the 12th of March at the usual time. And we will be hosting Rachel Nguy of the LSE, who will present a paper titled Gendered Change, 150 Years of Transformation in US Hours, right? So, it's now time for our informal discussion. I may start this one following up a little bit on Chris Michener's last question. I would like to ask a broader question. The period you are covering is very long, and there have been major changes in the monetary policy regime, right? And especially during the Nixon era, which you use for your narrative identification, economists still widely believed in the Phillips curve. They thought there was a trade-off between inflation and employment. And then, this belief faded away in the 1970s and 1980s. So, it looks like the political benefits of inflation may have evolved alongside these changes in the monetary policy regime, right? So I understand, your paper is about identification and you want to estimate an average effect. However, I wanted to push you a little bit and ask whether you could elaborate on how these effects of political pressure on monetary policy have evolved over time alongside these big changes.
Yeah, I agree. This is a concern. It's a little bit blunt to run a constant parameter VAR over that long a time period. I'm not the first one to do that. Maybe that's not the it's not the best
No, you're
excuse,
not.
but
Yeah, for sure.
it's certainly a concern. I think I can repeat what I said in my response to Chris. One thing I do is to do certain sample splits. That's just a simple way to alleviate that concern a little bit. But it doesn't, I don't know if I can ever completely alleviate that concern, that there are these underlying changes. Also, if these changes are exactly coincidental with these pressure episodes, it's hard. It's really hard to disentangle that. It's really hard to disentangle that. Maybe I can tell you about one other check that I did, which is about a specific change in the monetary regime, which is the end of the Bretton Woods exchange rate arrangement, right? That also happened in 1971. That's kind of a nightmare for me. That's in exactly that period. So one thing I did do is if I estimate the VAR and I drop the meeting variable, I just drop it. I say, let me forget about that. And then I do a narrative restriction and I basically say, I'm going to identify the shock that was the main driver of inflation following 1971. That shock doesn't really have a structural interpretation. It could be end of Bretton Woods, oil, political pressure. it's just a convolution shock, but I estimate that shock. I don't get the same persistence in the price level response. So when I bring in the meetings and I impose that the shock explains also the meetings, that's where I get that persistence. So that to me is a very indirect test for this one specific episode, but at least there I can see that the other stuff in 1971 that happened seem to do different things to inflation. I hope that makes sense. It's kind of an indirect test, but I also like that test.
No, that does make sense. In a way, maybe this is beyond the scope of your paper, and that's, an issue with the long-term samples, right? So I see that Nathan is raising his hand. So maybe you want to come in. So maybe I'll just tell the remaining participants that if they want to intervene and ask a question, they can just write, "I have a question" in the Q&A, and I'll unmute them if they wish. But Nathan, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Thomas, for a great paper. So let me try and relate to one of your puzzles at the end of the paper in terms of the impact of these interactions or these interactions with the president on inflation and expectations, but not on the real economy. So you point out to dispersion in inflation expectations as something that would mute these responses, but I think if you think about your entire narrative and also what you showed in the end in terms of the news media, so these were it was unlike the shocks that they use in the monetary policy shocks literature, which are shocks and therefore they have real impact. These things are not shocks in some sense. They're actually quite anticipated, and therefore, of course, they have an impact on inflation because they increase inflation. But since expectations adjust, then we would think that the real economy pretty much is unaffected as it's anticipated. So I think it plays in your favor in terms of saying that what you identified are not monetary shocks or things coming from the macro to the meetings, because otherwise you would have real effects. The fact that it's coming from the meetings to inflation, and the fact doesn't affect the macro is probably something that strengthens your analysis. And I wouldn't hang so much on the dispersion inflation rather than on the anticipation versus. So it's all absorbed in expected inflation, and rather than in some. So yeah. Basically, yeah.
I agree. I agree with that interpretation, and that's how I think about it as well. When I present it and the way I write the paper is I'm a little bit careful with that interpretation because in a strict sense, this is not true in my VAR. Because in the VAR, it's a structural shock that is IID, and that shock shouldn't lead to an expectation of future shocks. I think in practice, this is what it is, and it's picked up by the VAR. But in some sort of strict sense, my VAR shocks are unpredictable. But I agree with your interpretation. When you see a monetary easing and you see that happens because politicians told the central bank, I mean, you would expect a softer reaction of the central bank to inflation, probably in the future as well. And that is picked up in the inflation expectations, kind of in the true model in the economy. It's kind of like you're expecting a parameter change or you're expecting future shocks. So this is all a long-winded way of saying I agree with you, Nathan.
So Thomas, could you test this interpretation by distinguishing between your meetings, between the ones which were publicly known and advertised and the ones which remain secret? I mean, I understand we never know whether the news of the meetings remain private or public, but is that something you could possibly try to do to test the interpretation and the mechanism?
Yes, it's something that I'm working on. And it's it's actually difficult to excuse me. It's actually difficult to exactly, in a meeting by meeting sense, find exactly a newspaper article that reports about that specific meeting. So that's actually quite hard. But one idea that I have and that I'm working on implementing is I constructed from newspapers a general indicator of how often the media talks about political pressure on the Fed. So my idea is, and I haven't tried it, frankly, but to put that also in the VAR and then also put a sign restriction on that. So basically to say, now I have a political pressure shock, but then I can have something else. Let's call that an reported on political pressure shock. It has an additional restriction that it's getting talked about. And then I want to compare the responses. So I think this is in the spirit of what you're suggesting.
No, absolutely. That sounds very interesting and promising.
Yeah, I mean, as I said earlier, this newspaper stuff is just very messy to come up with some kind of clean series. And it's a bit, I mean, maybe I'm just a little bit slow with that. Also, how the logistics of that work with these newspaper archives. But that's my current. That's kind of a dream result that I would also like to have in the paper. That would be quite cool, I think.
Then, if this is the channel, the mechanism which explains your results, then the question, of course arises of why US presidents keep pressuring the Fed, right? So, and if they've read your paper, they should stop doing it. There's something a little bit like a Lucas critic here, right? Once you know the parameters, you adjust the policy, or so I'm wondering here, is there a lack of understanding of the mechanisms that you identify, or how do you interpret this constant pressure?
There are two possible explanations to me. One is there's a lack of understanding, and the second one is that maybe this pressure does stimulate activity of certain parts in the economy that are to the benefit of the president. If you think about it, if you are a US president who wants to be reelected, what matters for you is, Wisconsin, Michigan, what matters for you is the marginal voter. So ideally, what I would also like to look at is the pressure. Maybe it didn't move aggregate activity, but maybe it moved like swing voter activity or something like that. I mean, or, certainly maybe first time home buyers or something, they must have benefited from it. Rates were lower. Someone must benefit from that. Of course, inflation goes up and that also hurts people, but maybe there's some sort of a way to pin that down. Maybe there is a notion of success because it stimulates certain activities for certain people. That's also something I've thought about in follow-up work, maybe to look more into that.
Right, thanks. I see that Rui has turned on his video. Did you want to intervene?
No, I'm enjoying. Unfortunately, I think we're getting to the end.
Yeah, sorry, we could have continued that conversation. But yeah, so let's end it here because it's about time. So thank you so much again, Thomas, for presenting. So the next session will be on the 12th of March.
Thanks, Thomas. Thanks, Olivier. It's been great.
Thanks, Thomas.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.